Let us begin with a news section. What is this section going to talk about? It's going to talk about the different kind of sectors that our Indian economy is further divided into. So it is divided into four other sectors: unorganized and organized being the first division, and public and private being the second division. We are going to briefly discuss about each sector with certain examples and the definitions, and go about how we can understand this concept better. Right? Let's get into the section. So there is a division first between organized and unorganized. So this classification is mainly based on how the way the people are employed. Let us see whether it is formal sector or informal sector is what this is. So this kind of division is going to ask questions as to what are the conditions of work, right? Are there any kind of conditions that are being imposed on these workers? So that's one thing that we are going to answer. Then second question is, are there any kind of rules and regulations that these workers have to follow when they are employed in certain companies? That we are going to understand with these kind of two sectors. First, let's get into the organized sector. So this sector comprises of those companies where the terms of employment are regular. That means you have to sign a kind of a contract from the beginning saying you will be employed with this company for 1 year or more, such suppose 3 years, 5 years, etc. And this makes sure that people have work for that period of time. And this sector, the people who are working in this sector are also will have certain rules and regulations that are formed by the government itself. So they will have to follow different rules and regulations such as those of the Factories Act, the Minimum Wages Act, the Payment of Gratuity Act, Shops and Establishments Act. So you have to follow such rules and regulations. It is mandatory. So why exactly is it called organized? Because it has to follow some formal processes and procedures, right? And workers in this sector enjoy very good security of employment because they know for how long they are being employed because of the contract I've told you, and they're also expected to work for a fixed number of hours. So the company says you're supposed to work for 8 to 9 hours because the rule and the regulation that the government has set says you have to work only for so and so hours. So you have a fixed work hour for yourself. So what are the other benefits that are given out by the employer for the people who are employed in this company? You have paid leave. So what is paid leave? Suppose you have a certain emergency that you have to get out for 2 to 3 days out of town. The company will give you a leave, but it will be paid, which means you are going to be paid for those 3 days without you doing any work also. And you have payment during holidays. You have other medical benefits such as maternity leave, that is when you are carrying or when you are finally given birth to your child, you will not be physically fully efficient to do your work, and companies give something called maternity leave where you can take care of yourself and the baby completely and come back to office. Then you also have safe working environments around. Now let's get on to unorganized sector. So unorganized sector is a large sector in India especially, and you would have seen the kind of how this sector works in your daily basis. So these are small units that are there largely outside the control of the government. And there's absolutely no rule or regulation that are being followed by these companies. And the jobs that are paid in this sector are very low and they're not regular at all. And like the organized sector, there is no kind of secure employment. There is no contract, there is no paid leave, there is no maternity leave, there are no other benefits. A majority of the decisions that are taken in this sector depends on the person who has employed you. So it depends on either the owner of the company or the employer. So this sector mainly includes people at the street towing vehicles with vegetables or fruits, etc., and those of the repair work, the plumbers and etc. So now we know that the workers in this kind of unorganized sector are not being paid well on time. They're not being paid up to their whole potential. So how do we protect these workers? So who are the people in the unorganized sector who need this kind of a protection? In the rural areas, the unorganized sector usually comprises of landless agricultural laborers. So these are the ones usually who go and cultivate the land of a rich landlord, okay, or a rich farmer who has a large piece of land. These people go and cultivate on their lands for daily minimum wages. And you have small and marginal farmers who have very small pieces of land. And you have sharecroppers and artisans such as weavers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and goldsmiths. So this is a very shocking fact that around 80% of rural households in India are in the small and marginal farmer category. And hence, they have to be supported with some kind of facility for timely delivery of seeds and some kind of inputs and some kind of storage facilities that they cannot afford on their own. The government should kind of invest on these so that it's an easy job for them. So now that we've covered the rural areas, let us see what the unorganized sector is made up of in the urban areas. So first we have workers that are working in the small scale factories. Then you have those workers that you see every day based on construction. So these construction workers are hired on a contractual basis again, but with very few wages. Then workers in the trade and transport. Then you have the street vendors that you see on an everyday basis. You see the rag pickers and etc. So this industry also needs the government support in order to procure material and for raw output, because they cannot afford this on their own. So now let us see the other two kind of sectors, and this kind of division is based on the terms of ownership as to who owns such sectors. So who are the ones that own the majority share in that sector, who own the asset and who is ultimately responsible for service delivery? First is the public sector. So public sector means the government owns most of the assets and it provides most of the services. Suppose Indian Railways. The entire Indian Railways is controlled by the government itself, and government is the one that is giving out the services because it is doing its duty of providing such a service to the poor people who cannot afford to buy the other services such as bus service or car service. Then you have the private sector. The private sector means the ownership of most of the assets and the service delivery is in the hands of the private individuals. For example, you have Jio that was introduced recently, right? The Jio service like Airtel and Vodafone. Jio is mainly introduced by Reliance Industries Limited. RIL is owned by the Ambani family. So that is finally going under the hand of a private individual. So that is what private sector means. So mainly the activities that take place in the private sector are profit driven, right? They are giving out a service because they are ultimately making profit for themselves and the company. But the activities that are there in the public sector are not to earn profits, but the government wants to provide free services to the people who deserve it the most. So how does the government do some activities like this? Let us see. So there is a lot of inequality in India. So some people are very rich, some people are very poor who cannot afford anything. So what does the government do? It raises taxes from the rich people in the form of fuel or anything as such. So that tax is ultimately collected and is used to build some public universities, or it is used to build public parks or railways that everyone as a whole can use, right? So some governments in the recent day, they spend on many activities. So what are these activities? And why do the governments even spend on such activities? Let us see. So, like I've told you earlier, the government is the only entity that can provide a service for everyone. The private individual cannot produce the service for the whole of India, right? Because it does not make sense for one individual to produce so much for 130 crore people. So, some services are taken just by the government that will be very, very reasonable cost. And why is exactly this? Because the private individuals do not have that kind of money to produce a service for so many people, but the government can, right? In the form of taxes. So, what are the different kinds of services that are built up by the government? You have the construction of roads, you have the construction of bridges, you have construction of railways, generating electricity, and providing irrigation through dams. So these require a lot of capital that has to be invested, and this kind of benefit that is ultimately received should be given out to everyone. There is absolutely no kind of inequality by the government saying only these people should use the service and not another set of people. So suppose you are generating electricity, it is going to provide electricity for that entire community and not just a group of people. So this is why the government even takes up such activities. So in the private sector, there are some activities where the government has to support. The government will support when it knows the private sector is doing good for everyone. So that is when the government will intervene. So take a look at this example. This is for selling electricity for many industries. So some small scale industries cannot afford electricity on their own. So that's when the government steps in and says, okay, we will help this company for producing electricity because other people are going to get benefited by it and your company will grow. It will grow to an extent where this is a very, very long-term measure. So it's going to benefit everyone. And in the previous classes that you have seen something called the Pds system or the fair price system. So this is a scenario where the government has stepped in and has helped both the consumers and the farmers. How? The government has procured the grains from the farmers at a very good rate, which incentivizes the farmers to grow more because they will do well in the future for themselves. And the government has taken these grains and given out to the poor in the form of public distribution system. So the poor have taken these grains at a very lower cost, which helps in their nutritional needs, and they are very healthy to function so that they can develop for themselves and for the economy. They can contribute to the economy as well. So this is how the government has supported. So there are a very few activities where it is the sole responsibility for the government to intervene and say, yes, I have to spend completely on this. So what are these services like? They are health services and education services for all. And you must be very familiar that India's illiteracy is not that great when you compare it to the other parts of the world. That means we don't have good educational institutions, we have high dropout rates and etc. So it's the duty of the government to take this up and make sure that good education is reached out to everyone. And also regarding nutrition, not everyone has the access and affordability for food. That is when the government has conceptualized things like safe drinking water, giving housing for everyone, and also starting something called midday meal schemes so that the children who are the future of our country are given the basic and the proper nutrition so that they can be healthy individuals. So when you increase the government spending on such critical areas such as public health and education, it has an impact on the society first. Initially the individual, it impacts the individual, and when it impacts multiple individuals, it impacts the whole society, right? And once the whole society is doing very well in terms of health and education, there's ultimate development, very good societal and economic development that's happening in our country, which is a very, very good outcome.